name is Anthony Fuentes, and I'm a full stack developer with HUBzero. And today we are going to talk about HUBzero component development, and I'll be using my work on the HubICL Toolbox component as an example. So before we start talking about component development, I thought it would be a good idea to define what a component is. And so component has its own functionality, its own database tables, its own user interface, and some examples of components are a forum, a blog, a community system, or a photo gallery. That's an excerpt from our documentation. And you can think of a component as basically a standalone application that is sort of connected to a hub. And I have a link to the documentation there, so afterwards, if you get the slides from myself or Claire, you can read a bit more about what a HUBzero component is. And so here is a visual diagram that sort of shows what the major elements of a component are. A component has a user interface in the form of web pages, and it has a database where data that pertains to that component is stored. And in between those two, there's data processing logic that connects the user interface in the form of pages to the database. So when it came to getting started with the Toolbox component, the first thing that we did was meet with the HubICL team. And the HubICL team is made up of members from Purdue's Center for Intercultural Learning, Mentorship, Assessment, and Research, or CILMAR for short. And during that meeting, we sort of discussed what the HubICL team wanted the Toolbox component to be, what some of their ideas were for the component, and what their goals for the component were. And that initial meeting was really helpful because it provided me with a couple of documents to use. One was the HubICL Toolbox project charter, which was a Word document that had background on the HubICL team, some written specifications for the Toolbox component, the goals of the project, and some target dates. Another document that I got from as a result of that meeting was the HubICL team's tool spreadsheet, which had data for every tool that the HubICL team had been using up to that point. And so here are a couple of excerpts from those documents. Here you can see from the HubICL Toolbox project charter, some specifications, as well as the objective of the Toolbox component project. And down here you can see a snippet from the tool spreadsheet that has columns, as well as some of the data that each of the tool rows had. And so when it came to getting started, I first started with the database side of the Toolbox component. And in order to do that, I created an entity relationship diagram, or ERD for short. And you can think of an entity relationship diagram as the blueprint for a database. It lists all of the tables that will be present in the database, as well as all the data that will be present on those tables. And so when it comes to building an ERD, what you want to do is you want to identify the entities or nouns present in the data. And so for the Toolbox, one example would be tools. Another example was tool types. So every tool had an associated tool type. And you can imagine that for a complex application, there will be a lot of entities present in the data. And one thing you want to do is try and keep your entities separate, because that will make updating data and keeping track of data that much easier, since it's sort of compartmentalized. And each entity represents a separate database table. So by keeping it separate, you make it a lot easier for yourself to take data that you have in a spreadsheet and translate it into a database. Once you have your entities separated out, you want to figure out how those entities are related to each other. One common entity relationship is the one-to-many relationship. And so an example of that would be from the Toolbox component, any given tool had many downloads associated with it. So one tool owned many downloads. And so when it came to developing the Toolbox entity relationship diagram, that tool spreadsheet came in handy. Since it detailed all of the data that any tool would have, I was able to go through that spreadsheet and sort of separate out the different entities and then use the columns there to create the fields in the database. But there had to be some updating. I had to go back to the HubICL team and talk with them and ask questions about what sort of functionality they were looking for, because that informs the design of the database. Certain features you might want in a component might require extra fields on a database table. For instance, if you have certain data that you want to be published or unpublished, you have to track that state in your database. And so being able to meet with the HubICL team and ask questions made my job a lot easier in terms of figuring out what fields I would need to create on the database. So here's an example, again, an excerpt from the tool spreadsheet and a simplified version of the resulting entity relationship diagram. You can see that the entities present are tools, tool types, downloads, and you can also see the relationships between them. This is sort of technical notation. These lines, they signify the relationships between the different entities. And I used a tool called StarUML to create it. If you're interested in doing entity relationship diagramming, I would recommend it. I found it really easy to use and really helpful. So moving on, at this point, I had created a plan for implementing the database. Now I switched to working on developing the user interface, which is one of the other major elements of a component. User interface design is very open-ended, so it could be its own talk, and I won't go into too much detail. But what I will say is something to consider when thinking about what user interface you want your component to have is how complex it'll be. Some interfaces require more complex data processing logic depending on what that interface does. And the more complex an application is, the more time it takes to develop. Some factors that contribute to complexity are the number of elements on a page, actions that can be taken from the page. So can a user create data? Can they update data and delete data from that same page? If they can, that means there are a lot of possible paths through your data processing logic to the database. The responsiveness of a page also influences its complexity. If you have elements on the page that refresh or change without the page fully refreshing, that takes time to develop as well. So when it came to designing an interface for the Toolbox component, I created some mock-ups based on the entity relationship diagram I had created, as well as specifications from the project charter. And I used a tool called Balsamiq Mockups. If you search the web, there are a plethora of different mock-up tools out there, and they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. For me, Balsamiq worked really well. And after I created an initial set of drafts of pages, I presented them to the HubICL team, and then they gave me their feedback, and I updated the mockups based on their feedback. And we went through 2 to 3 rounds of this process before we arrived at a user interface, a set of pages that we thought was close enough to the final goal that we could iterate after they had been coded without having to start from scratch or redo too much work. And so here are a couple of examples of changes that occurred in mockups. So here is a sort of link bar that tracks different steps in creating a tool. And so you can see in the top that the steps are different from the steps in the second image. And another example is here. So this mock-up shows the tool search result page. So in the top left, you can see one draft. And after presenting that to the HubICL team and getting their feedback, I updated it, and it became the second draft, which is pretty close to the final product. So when it came to deployment and development, after I had planned out what the user interface would look like and what the database would look like, I started coding. And once I got to a point where all of the sort of core functionality was present, I deployed an alpha version to HubICL, which allowed the HubICL team to get some hands-on experience working with the component and provide me with additional feedback. So there was no hard launch. I didn't code the component and say, we're done now. I coded the component, deployed it to HubICL, and then solicited the HubICL team's feedback, and then iterated on that component. So there was continued development, and new code was constantly being integrated into the component for the HubICL team to work with. One of the target dates that was presented in the Toolbox charter was for a presentation. And at that presentation, the Toolbox was demoed and user feedback was received, and that led to additional development and changes. Now the Toolbox is in a relatively stable state, but there's still the potential for it to be changed. And that takes us to our next slide. And so the development process that I used when it came to developing the HubICL Toolbox was an Agile software development approach, where I started by planning, and once that planning was done, I implemented what I had planned. I deployed it so that the HubICL team could look at it and work with it. I got their feedback, and then started the process all over again. And by doing that, I was able to go through several different iterations of the Toolbox, which was really helpful in getting myself and the HubICL team on the same page in terms of what they wanted the Toolbox to be. And that ultimately led to a product that is as close as possible to what the HubICL team wanted. And you can contrast the Agile software development approach to another software development approach called the Waterfall method. And in the Waterfall method, each step in the development of an application or a component is sort of separate from all the others, and progress only goes one way. In general, you collect all your requirements, you do the design, you implement, and then you generally don't go back. You don't revisit designs and change implementation. It just sort of goes one way, whereas with Agile development, you're constantly iterating and including new features or changes based on meetings with the customer. And I've found that taking the Agile approach to software development and component development to be really helpful, being able to meet with the team that's going to be using your component, make sure that you as a developer are going in the right direction and you're making a product that is going to serve the customer well.